going to have a study in encouraging Christ, which sounds quite strange, but during his earthly ministry, there were times where he looked for encouragement, such as the night before his crucifixion. He wanted encouragement and prayer with his disciples, and they went to sleep on him, but he was looking for emotional help and spiritual help at that time. So this is entitled, Let's Encourage Christ. And what is the meaning of that symbol? It's that the Christian life is pretty straightforward, and we should not get captured into a maze of performance-based Christianity, but instead we should be caught up with the beauty of the Trinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. We'll examine the discouraged Christ by going to the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, in the book of Isaiah, there is a whole series of songs of the servant. And they're actually predictions, 5 predictions, 5 songs, actually, they're called. They're written as poetry in the Hebrew Bible. And they give us an intimate view of Christ's attitude towards his ministry. And one of these songs of the servant is in Isaiah 49, verses 1 through 6. And it starts out with the servant speaking to the people and speaking about God the Father who sent him. The servant described here is the servant of the song in Isaiah 52 and 53, where Christ's suffering is described. So it says, "Listen to me, O islands, and pay attention, you people from afar. The Lord, or Yahweh, called me from the womb. From the body of my mother, he named me, and he made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand, he has concealed me, and he has also made me a select arrow. He has hidden me in his quiver." So the Son views himself as a weapon in the hands of God, and then he shows what his commission is. And he, Yahweh, said to me, "You are my servant Israel." And the servant is called Israel a number of times because he's the Israel indeed. He is going to fulfill what Israel was intended to fulfill. And he said to me, "You are my servant Israel, in whom I will show my glory." And in the New Testament, the greatest glory of Christ and of God is the work of Christ on the cross. So this is describing the commission of the servant. However, there's a challenge, and the servant speaks. "But I said, I have toiled in vain," or literally, I have toiled for no purpose. "I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity." You see that word vanity? It's hevel. And there's a very famous character in the book of Genesis named Hevel. And his English translation of Hevel is Abel. And the name Abel meant emptiness, or a bubble of air, vanity, nothing. "I have spent my strength for nothing and emptiness. Yet surely the justice due to me is with the Lord, with Yahweh, and my reward with my God." Notice verse 4. "I have toiled for no purpose. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity." This is Christ speaking to the Father It's described in this prophetic song in the Old Testament, and it sounds pretty discouraged to me, like he is lamenting the fact that his ministry appears quite ineffective. Now, Yahweh responds. And now, Yahweh, now the Lord who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, in order that Israel might be gathered to him. For I am honored in the sight of the Lord, and my God is my strength. And that parenthesis implies that Christ is speaking. Then he says, Yahweh says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones, the ones who have been faithful of Israel. I will also make you a light of the nations so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Notice verse 4 and notice verse 6. In verse 4, failure, just plain failure, where he admits his mission is a failure. And what's the mission? To bring Israel back to God. And that did not turn out too well. Then Yahweh turns around and says, I have a bigger thing. I will make you a light. You will bring a light to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. So notice how it goes from an area of discouragement to a massive broadening of the plan of God. Now, this is an Old Testament song that describes Christ evaluating his ministry to Israel, and then God giving him a greater ministry. Well, what we're going to do is go over to the Gospel of Matthew and see how this worked out. But in a way, it's a bit encouraging to me that the Son of God in his humanity experienced what we sometimes experience, failure. And failure is not necessarily a defeat. It may be a strategic regathering by God to a greater purpose. And this is what we will see here. We're first going to examine a series of failures, so to speak, on Christ's part. To some Christians, it sounds downright blasphemous to say Christ failed. How could Christ fail? He's God. How could the Son of God fail? He's the Son of God. How could he fail? That sounds terrible. God can do anything, and he's failed. Well, the way human beings are created produces failure, meaning human beings are made in the image of God. They have godlike capacities, and one of those capacities is belief, trust, and partnership. And with the fall of Adam, our ability to believe, to trust, and to form a partnership with God has gone out the window. And here Christ is coming to Israel, trying to gather them unto himself. And the failure is on Israel's part, but the failure is felt by the Son of God. And so if you've experienced failure, and every human being has, our Savior is not a stranger to things not going the way he really wants them to go. So we'll see how what we've looked at briefly in the Old Testament, how this is played out in the New Testament, and how Christ is encouraged, and how in a very real sense we can encourage Christ. If a negative response discourages him and makes him think about the purposelessness of it all, well, maybe a positive response will encourage him. Let's take a look and see. The encouraged Christ. So we'll start in Matthew 11, and we'll be looking at 3 chapters. We'll do an overview of them. And Matthew 11 and 12 describe a series of questionings and rejections of Christ where he fails in his mission to regather Israel. And the first person who doubts him is the one who preceded him, John the Baptist. Now notice Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 through 5. Now when John was in prison, heard of the works of Christ, of the Messiah, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?" Well, that's quite a twist, because earlier in the Gospels, John is proclaiming that this is the Messiah of God, and that John is not worthy to unloose his sandals, to take the shoes off of his feet. And then he comes out with, "Are you the expected one? Or shall we look for someone else?" Well, the fellow's in prison. So we should have some understanding of that. That's a discouraging place to be. But it's not the most encouraging thing in the world to have your front guy, the opening act, so to speak, turn around and say, "Are you the one I'm really supposed to be introducing here?" It is not the most positive thing that could happen to the Christ. And then Jesus doesn't give him a straight answer. He gives him an adult answer. Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk." And that's a quote right from the book of Isaiah, talking about the ministry of the Messiah. "The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." And he doesn't give a straight yes and no. He says, "John, figure it out. I have been doing the signs of the Messiah. Figure it out." But notice how it starts with a significant and powerful question from John, saying, "Are you the expected one?" It's not an encouraging chapter, and it gets worse. Jesus begins to reproach in chapter 11 the cities in which most of his miracles were done. So here he is performing miracles that are astounding, that shake people to their sandals, and yet it doesn't lead to a profound change of heart. The miracles don't convince the unbelieving heart. It just slows it down. Miracles don't convince the unbelieving heart. Faith is the greatest compliment we can give to a good God. Simply trust him. And miracles don't convince a faithless heart. The faithless heart will just ask for more miracles, and probably self-serving ones. Then he began to reproach the cities in which most of his miracles were done, because they did not repent. "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida!" These are cities up in Galilee in northern Israel. "For if the miracles had occurred in Tyre and Sidon, among the Gentiles, among the pagans, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. It's almost like they're super hardened steel. Their hearts are rocks, concrete, and miracles will not change the basic foundation of unbelief. It is not a miracle that changes the human perspective. It's the gospel plus the power of the Holy Spirit. Then the Pharisees, the religious leaders of Israel, those who consider themselves the best educated, the most serious, the most godly among Israel, and their evaluation of Christ, which not only is in the New Testament, but is also in the writings of the rabbis from this approximate time period, where they say that Jesus was illegitimate and Jesus was demon possessed. But when the Pharisees heard that he's casting out demons, they said, this man casts out demons only by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons. That's another name for Satan. So we've got another source of discouragement after chapter 11 in chapter 12. Now, these experiences of discouragement are building up to something tremendous, something that every Christian who is serious about participating in the plan of God needs to understand. But this switch that we'll be looking at in chapter 13 is based upon the failure of Israel to respond to its Messiah. Now it gets worse. It started out with John the Baptist. Now it goes on to Jesus' own family. Matthew puts it nicely. Another gospel says the disciples believed that Christ was out of his mind. It's a nice Greek word. He's standing outside of himself. He's out of his mind. We say out of his mind. The way they said it in Greek, he's standing outside of himself. He's no longer sane. So in verse 46, chapter 12 again, 11 to 12. While he was still speaking to the multitudes, behold, his mother and brothers were standing outside, seeking to speak to him. And someone said to him, behold, your mother and brothers are standing outside, seeking to speak to you. But he answered the one who was telling him and said, who is my mother? And who are my brothers? And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, behold, my mother and my brothers. What makes a person a family member of the Trinity and a family member of Christ is this thing called faith. Faith is what drives the relationships of the Trinity. Love and faith, love and trust. They love each other, they trust each other. But 11 and 12 of Matthew pulls different events from the life of Christ, and the way Matthew works it, he puts all of these rejections, in a sense, in one spot, in one section, chapters 11 and 12. Chronologically, they occur at different points in the other Gospels, but he pulls them together because Matthew is a topical gospel. And so he draws these rejections of Christ, puts them together because he wants that to be the background for what occurs in chapter 13. Chapter 13 is God the Father's answer to Christ's discouragement in not being able to regather Israel. One of the things, again, that we have to think through is God frequently fails. Remember, he gave advice to Cain about Abel. First counseling, when I was in seminary and I would speak to counseling students, I would say, you know, sometimes you're going to fail and sometimes you're going to have horrible results out of your counseling. Just remember that the first guy in the Old Testament that God ever counseled went out and committed murder. So if God failed and you fail every once in a while, encourage yourself. Failure happens. It's not recommended, but failure happens. And God is used to it because he's used to working with human beings and he's putting his best efforts into what he's doing. So let's go to God the Father's response in chapter 13. And in chapter 13, we have 7 parables and then a little add-on called the scribe, which talks about anybody who's really a student of the kingdom and what he should do. But in chapter 13, Christ gives the alternative strategy. Very, very important. He's going to give the strategy of taking the light to the Gentiles. And this strategy will be true both for the dispensation of the church, the time period when the church is on the earth, and the time period of the tribulation period until Christ returns to judge the earth. It is God's strategy to take the light, to make Christ the light to the Gentiles, and take the salvation of God to the ends of the earth, which will be accomplished through the church and through the tribulation period. Now, that's a whole nother subject, but we're going to look at these parables. And a parable is an illustrative story designed to catch the imagination, but it can only be understood by those who have ears to hear. That is, those who are trusting Christ, wanting to understand the ways of God and ways of Christ. So the person who has ears to hear can hear the stories and figure them out. Unbelief can't figure anything out because it doesn't trust the source of the stories. So he's telling the stories to those who have ears to hear, those who have trusted him. And he says, as far as the Israelites who rejected me, they'll be blind as bats. They won't get them at all. But if you have ears to hear, you can get these stories. And stories are a wonderful way of communicating. Parables. And a parable literally is something that is thrown along something else. Here's a concept, and a parable is thrown alongside of it to explain a concept. And typically, parables or stories do a better job of explaining concepts. So the first parable is the parable of the sower. Very famous parable. And it's about scattering seed and the results of scattering the seeds of truth. Then following that is the parable of the tares among the wheat, the parable of the mustard seed, and the parable of leaven. And it is a set of 4. Then after he tells these parables to the crowd, he goes into a house with his disciples, and his disciples say, Could you explain what on earth you were talking about? Could you just explain this? And he does start explaining it. And then he proceeds to give 4 more parables. One, the treasure in the field. The other, the pearl. The last in the series, the dragnet. Now, the first 7 parables deal with God's strategy. The 8th one is really an address to the disciples saying, you guys are like scribes who draw things out of the Old Testament and will be drawing things out of my teaching, and you'll bring old and new things together, which is a very important progressive revelation concept. Old things and new things will be brought together, and you'll be like that kind of scribe. So that really is, that last one is not really a series, part of the set of the series that is going to describe Christ's strategy, but it's really an observation on the nature of those who have ears to hear. Will be those who can see the things of the Old Testament and the things of the New Testament and draw conclusions from them. Now, what I'm going to do is, before I get to the parable of the sower, which is the critical one that all the other ones hinge off of, I'm going to talk about the treasure in the field and the pearl. And I have 2 reasons for this. One is to make you feel pretty good about God's ways. And then the second is to think about the value that God puts on human beings and you, because that is the reason for this strategy. You are the reason for this strategy. In these 7 parables, and in the treasure in the field and in the pearl, we have the great heart of God and of Christ revealed. Then the strategy that's based upon the great heart and worth he places upon us is given, starting with the sower. But I'm going to go down then to the 5th and the 6th parables. And then we're going to go back to the beginning. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty straightforward. So the encouraged Christ. This is the strategy that God the Father and Christ put together after Christ failed to regather Israel because of the unbelief of Israel. The treasure in the field. This is a very important parable because it addresses 2 things about God's attitude towards you. And it starts out, the kingdom of heaven, the kingly authority of the God of heaven. The way God works is like. Now, the word kingdom, typically, it's translated kingdom, but literally it means kingly authority. A king has territory, but what makes it a kingdom is the kingly authority. So if you look at a Greek dictionary, look up the word basileia, kingdom, they'll actually talk about kingdom authority. So the kingdom of heaven, God's authority that comes from heaven, is like a treasure. The way heaven works is like a treasure hidden in the field. Nobody knows it's there, which a man found and hid. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. So man's out in a field, finds a treasure. Nobody else has found it. He had eyes. He put in the effort. He found it. And then he hid it again. Sounds like peculiar stuff. But actually, in Paul's letter to the Colossians, Paul said that who we are is hidden by God in Christ. Who believers really are as the family of God, as those who are joined to Christ, who have God as a Father, who have a partnership with the Holy Spirit, that's pretty much hidden from this world. It's just hidden stuff. A man found and hid this treasure. Now, what's the treasure? You. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has. And what is all that God the Father has? His Son. You can't ask for more than that. That's the great treasure. That's the great possession of God the Father. And buys that field. He buys the entire field, which would represent the world, represents the world, to get at the people who are going to trust the gospel, the people who God has been in love with since the beginning of time, since the beginning of the creation of the heavens and earth. Now, I'm going to focus in on this word joy. And the reason for that is that many Christians functionally don't have God as a friend. They have him as a God. They have him as a savior. But they don't have him as a friend. Why do I say that? It's because if they ran into God in a crowd, they wouldn't recognize him. Because they don't have a friendship. What's a friendship? If I have a friend, first of all, I know his name. Secondly, I can recognize him on sight. Thirdly, I have a pretty good idea of how my friend thinks. And fourthly, I understand his emotional life. Because all friendships are a connection of emotional life, thinking together, recognition of each other, and knowing each other's name. But there's an emotional connection. There's a connection of thought. And one of the sad things, and we see this in Head to Heart all the time, I mean, absolutely all the time. We have hundreds and hundreds of people all over the world involved in Head to Heart. And what is, for most of them, the most common feature of them, they don't understand the emotions of God and how he feels about them. They don't understand that they bring joy to God just by breathing. If they breathe, God enjoys them. Now, that sounds like a shocking statement, because then the Christian will say, but I sinned. Well, yeah, let's take that for granted. I have children, adult children. When they were growing up, they sinned a lot. Their offspring will sin a lot. Do we enjoy them less, love them less? Of course not. Can God do better than we do with our grandchildren and children? Sure. And here, buying the field gives him joy. Now, these parables are talking about God's strategy in this world. It's not talking about our response to that strategy. There are some Bible teachers who flip this around and says, this is talking about us and us selling everything we have to get the treasure, which is God. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't match the context. This is describing God's strategy. And notice that word joy. That's tremendously important. And notice the implicit emphasis on value. Two very important things. An implicit emphasis on value, and a motivation of joy. How valuable are you? You're valuable enough that God will sell everything. Now, God can create anything, but the one thing he hasn't created is his son. And his son is everything. And he's given everything for us out of joy. That's why we have Isaiah 53:10, a very strange verse. It pleased Yahweh, it delighted Yahweh to crush him, to crush the serpent out of joy at getting to that treasure. This is an emphasis, a very clear emphasis on worth and joy. It's an expression of worth. And what drives the strategy in the Gospels is the treasure that's in the field. And how do you get to the treasure? First, you buy the field. Then you go and you collect the treasure. So we have the hidden treasure in the field. Now we have another parable. But before that parable, let me give you a little chart. You see the words love, joy, desire, glad, and family affection. Those are all words which are used of God and Christ's attitude towards believers. And they're all emotional terms. They're all emotional terms. To have a friendship, we have to understand how our friend thinks. We have to know his name. We have to be able to recognize him on sight. And we have to know and be able to predict his emotional life. Well, the emotional life of the Trinity towards the believer is very predictable. They love and they have joy over and a positive emotional response to believers. Now, notice the word joy. That comes from the parable of the treasure in the field. So that one we've already talked about. But you see the word love, you see the word desired, you see the word glad. Those words are used of God the Father concerning believers. And it says in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4-5, just as he, God the Father, chose us in him, Christ, before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him in love. That's agape love. That is a passionate delight that will sometimes lead to sacrifice. In love, he predestined us to adoption as sons and daughters, through Jesus Christ to himself, according to the kind intention. You see the word kind intention? It refers to having a really positive thought in the mind that satisfies the desires. It's a really interesting word. It's something that you think is really good. I want this. Is combined of good and I think. And it refers to something I want. I think that's really good. So it implies desired. God desires us. He finds joy in us. He has a love for us. And then you see the kind intention of his will. That in other places is translated as glad. It's it literally means a settled desire that makes God happy. A happy, settled desire. That's called being glad. God has love, joy, desire for us, gladness about us. Those emotions have to become settled in our mind and heart about God's attitude towards us. Because when they become settled, we become liberated. When we find God's attitude towards us as predictably positive, then we'll relax. In the New Testament, there's not one verse in the New Testament that says God is angry with believers. But there is not one word that says God is angry with believers. God's angry about a lot of stuff, but he's not angry with believers. He's going to be quite angry with those who reject the gospel because they're rejecting his heart, his son. But not one verse, nor any verse that says he's outraged with believers. He's outraged with non-believers because he had his son die for them. And if they reject the son, he's not happy. So there's these settled emotions about you. And that's why you're a treasure. You bring joy to a Father in heaven. And then we have family affection. And that's found in John 16:27. And the word love in the diagram you see is the word agape. But in John 16:27, what's translated love there is the Greek word phileo, which is family affection or family love. The additional thought is that this is like love for family members. And Jesus speaks to his disciples and he says, for the Father himself loves you like a relative, family affection, loves you like a relative, because you have loved me like a relative. The word phileo occurs twice, and it's talking about a family connection. And he says, you've trusted me. You've trusted me like a family member. God feels about you like a family member. And you have loved me like a family member and have believed that I came forth from the Father. Now we're getting to the strategy that God is using in this world. But what drives that strategy is worth and love. The worth that God puts upon you, he decides that you're worth a son to him. You're worth knowing, and you bring him joy. And that's something that we should relax into and enjoy. Because once we start relaxing into God's joy and become peaceful and joyful, we'll begin to serve out of real gratitude. And not out of guilt, not out of shame, not out of worthlessness, but genuine gratitude. So we went to that particular parable to set up the parameters. Why this strategy? There's a treasure found in the field. How do you dig out the treasure? Now there's another parable, the parable of the pearl of great value, or the way the King James puts it, the pearl of great price. Now, it's really interesting that Christ puts in this very important series of seven, two parables that deal with the worth of believers. Two parables. Christ died for the whole world, and out of humanity, he has placed his love upon those who believe the gospel. He has a love for humanity and a great love for those who respond and trust the Son. Again, notice the repetition. He told us about the treasure in the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. Notice again the emphasis on value. You are worth a son to God. That's the value. What we decide to pay for something gives its value. I can remember years ago being with my son Andrew when he was about 19, and he came with me to a church service to help me out with audio video stuff. Now he's a professional videographer. And we were seated in the front row, and we were at a with it church where they did everything that was with it at that time. There are churches that are just a total reflection of imitating others. And this is one of those imitation churches. And I'll leave it at that. We're seated in the front row. And my son is looking up at the worship band that's up on the stage. And he says, Dad, you see that guitar? That is worth a lot of money. I looked around and I saw one wooden guitar and then a bunch of plastic guitars. And I said, that one? And I pointed at one of the plastic ones. And he said, oh, no, that's cheap. He said, that wooden one. And I said, well, that's a piece of junk. It's worn out. It looks dirty. And he said, that's a Fender. That's a Fender guitar. That's worth a lot of money. And I said to him, I wouldn't pay a penny for it. One, I don't play. And two, it looks junky. What we're willing to pay determines the worth of the object. God was willing to pay with his own son. He could create anything, but his payment is his son. You're worth a son to God, as is, because he gave a son for you as is. It's incredible. It means he sees something in you that we don't see in ourselves. We're just an enigma to ourselves. And upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought it. So there we have the parameters. Now we're going to come to the strategy that gets to the treasure in the field and digs the treasure out. So let's see what the strategy is. And it's an interesting strategy because a 75% failure rate is built into it. Christ is used to failure because chapters 11 and 12 says that a lot of times he was involved in failed attempts. Sounds discouraging, but it really isn't. It's the way of finding the treasure. And you notice on your screen from the kahal of Israel, kahal is the Hebrew word for congregation, the gathering of the people, to the ecclesia, that's the Greek word for congregation, to the congregation of the church. And the strategy of the ecclesia is different than the strategy of the kahal or congregation of Israel. How did you get into the congregation of Israel? You're born into it. Genetically, you're a Jew. You're a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You're born into it. But the ecclesia or the congregation of the church is you believe your way into it. You get into it by faith, by trusting the messenger. And then we're born again. And there is a shift in God's strategy. And the shift is from a nation, the nation of Israel, which was a pilot project that failed. Now, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, failure is sort of a standard operating procedure for what God does. And it failed. And then he's now turning around and creating a movement to the world, a movement of the gospel being taken to the world, from a nation to a movement based on the proclamation of the gospel. But this proclamation is going to have approximately a 75% failure rate. Now, we should get that into our heads because any salesman knows that a high failure rate does not mean you're a bad salesman. It means you're a good salesman because you're out selling. And so here, let's take a look at how this works. Be prepared. If you share the gospel, be prepared for a 75% failure rate. Now, that's really good to keep in the back of your brain because it means you won't get discouraged when somebody says, that's crazy, you're crazy, and I want no part of it. That's just the way it is. And to get emotional about it, it's a waste of energy. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom, this is Matthew 13, the first parable that gives the strategy from going from the congregation of Israel to the ecclesia of the church, the congregation of the church. Israel was formed by birth. The church is the treasure in the field, and the shovel that digs it out is called the gospel. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, they don't have ears to hear. The evil one comes, Satan, and snatches away what has been sown in the heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. Now, there's a little bit of a difference between how they planted seed in the ancient world and how we do it today. Today, we dig a furrow and they plunk in seeds, and then they cover up the seeds. That's not how they did it. In the ancient world, the farmer went out to the field. He didn't plow it up. He scattered the seed first, and then he came back and he plowed the field and buried the seeds that way. Well, this is the seed that was sown beside the road. It really didn't land when he threw some of the seed. Some of it landed beside the road and it got nowhere. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. This is the kind of person who is clueless as to what they're hearing. And then Satan comes along and says, you don't understand it anyway. Let me pull it out of your heart. That's the first failure. Then, and the one on whom the seed was sown on the rocky places. This is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Remember, the seed is sown, the field is plowed, the man gets to the rocky part of it and he moves the plow around it because the plow would be destroyed by the rocks. So the seed is just left on the rocks and there's no depth of soil. And the one on whom the seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. And yet he has no firm root in himself because it landed on the rocks, but is only temporary. There's no soil, no depth of soil. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, he immediately falls away. He just drifts away. There's no depth. So we have another failure. Implicit in sending the gospel to the Gentiles, implicit to making Christ the light of the world, is a bit of failure. Now we have the third one. And the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns. Because remember, when the plow comes along, it's going to bury the thorns and it's going to bury the seed. So the seed will come up, the thorns will come back. And what do the thorns do? This is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word. What's going on in the man's heart? He's preoccupied with wealth, status, importance, money, and the deceitfulness of riches choke out the word because his heart doesn't have any room for the love of God and God's love for her or him. The deceitfulness of riches choke the word and it becomes unfruitful. Failure. Notice the failure rate. When I speak to pastors, I always make a point of saying failure is part of the job. And if you get all churned up over failure, you're missing the strategy. You're on a hunt for the treasure. And if you come up with rocks, don't call them treasure and spend a great deal of time on the rocks. Find the gold. Because every once in a while, the astonishing thing happens where the person says, I've been waiting for this my whole life. This is the most incredible thing I've ever heard. It is majestic. I buy it. And change occurs. Magical change occurs. Spiritual change occurs. Fantastic to watch. Sort of a shock, especially if you're out there spreading the seed and getting nowhere, and then wham, you see this response and you go, what is going on here? Well, you found the treasure. But notice the failure rate. Think about chapters 11 and 12. Failure. Notice the failure rate here, but also notice the success which comes next. And the one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, and that word good is the Greek word kalos, which means noble soil. Noble soil. What's noble soil? Noble soil is soil that hears that the God-man, that God died on a cross. And the noble soil says, that is the most amazing thing. That is astonishing that God should die for me. The Creator should die for me. That is astonishing. Noble. A noble response to the most noble thing done in the history of the universe. Nobility responding to nobility. And God turns around and says, I like your taste. You recognize nobility when you see it. I like you. I liked you before you were ever born, and I like you even more now because you've done the most important thing a human being can do. Recognize the beauty of what occurred on the cross. The Son of God, according to John chapter 1, created everything that is. And the Son of God died for everything that is, to bring back everything to God. He bought the whole world to bring back everything to God. And if 75%, 80%, 90% of the world says, forget it, what a silly thing to do. Well, there's a noble treasure that says, we recognize the beauty of what occurred on the cross and we'll buy into it. And if the rest of you jokers want no part of it, that's not our problem. That's yours. And the one on whom seed was sown on the noble soil, this is the person, woman or man, who hears the word and understands it. They get the implications of it, that they're loved. There's a Father in heaven who finds joy in them. They understand that they must be worth something to this God. Now, we never will fully understand the implications of this in time or eternity, but we can experience the implication of this by believing God's joy in what he's doing and God's value that he places on you, who indeed bears fruit and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Now you should immediately notice that there's three numbers there: 100-fold, 60, 30. And there are three failures there. And yet the person, the noble heart that believes this gospel, this noble heart will be able to match the lack of productivity of the other three failures. Highly productive, because they understand, they buy it, and they bear fruit, because they see the implications behind this, and they recognize that God is hunting for the treasure. So how can you be an encouragement to the Christ? Well, first of all, notice these statistics: 0, 0, 0. Well, that's not very encouraging. But notice 160, 30. That's pretty encouraging. And how do we encourage Christ? Well, we respond to the truth. We believe it. We believe it to the extent where we feel loved, we feel gratitude, we trust, and then we act, and we bear fruit. And if we have a sense of being loved by God and love God back, and this is what Head to Heart is all about, our discipleship program. If we love God and love God back, if we're grateful, then according to Paul, we should do everything we do, either in word or deed, out of gratitude, and become productive. But it is the noble heart that understands, experiences God's love, and responds. So some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. That 160 and 30, that's pretty productive. And that means that more seed can be scattered, more people can be fed, and good things can happen. You've got tremendous production from that hidden treasure. So as we think about those 7 parables, the strategy is defined by spreading the gospel. The danger is that within the church, there'll be tares, or people who represent themselves as Christians but aren't. That's something that we need to take into account. And then furthermore, not only will there be tares, but we also have to understand that the gospel and God's strategy is like leaven working its way through a bowl, and it permeates. One of the things that people underestimate about the church is the permeation, if there is such a word, through the culture. As the church lives its life and changes lives, then as the church does that, it'll permeate. But it will not be a political movement, an explosive political movement. It's never intended to be. But it's to be a people movement, and the people gather in congregations where they live out the culture of heaven, and they draw others by the attractiveness of their lives. And that causes the spread of the gospel. It's a permanent permeation of the culture, and it's productive. Then there are two more parables that are given, which talks about Christ's return and judging this world. Now, that occurs at the end of the tribulation period, which means that the strategy of preaching will continue through the church dispensation, time of the church, and into the time of the tribulation period. And then it ends with the return of Christ with the church to the earth. When you share the gospel with somebody, this sounds like a pretty cold attitude, but it's realistic. Thank the ones who are unresponsive for their time. Say, I'm glad you listened to me, appreciate it. And then find the ones who do respond. Meaning, the goal of the gospel and the way Paul practiced the gospel, he simply said, here is an area, everybody in this area is going to hear the gospel. We know some will respond, and we know a lot won't. But our goal is to give the gospel to the area. It's not to give the gospel 1,000 times to a person who says no 1,000 times. That's not the gospel strategy. The gospel strategy is to give the gospel, leave the results with God, and go on to the next person. It's much more efficient than endlessly repeating the same thing to the same person who says, oh my goodness, will you leave me alone? Take the hint, leave them alone and get on to the next person. And that next person may become a real shocker because they'll respond with zeal. So thank the ones who are unresponsive. Thank them for giving you the time, and then go on. That was the strategy that God gave Christ in the face of the failure of Israel. That was his encouragement. He said, forget this business of going to Israel. Let's turn around and take this thing to the world. And let's make you a light to the whole world. And this is how it worked itself out. From the discouraged Christ to the encouraged Christ. So how do we encourage Christ? Well, first of all, to recognize that God the Father has an emotional life. The God-man, Christ, has an emotional life. And we should do things that please them. That encourages them. So cultivate your soul in these truths as you cultivate your life in the church. The church is where the treasure in the field gathers. And cultivate your soul as you cultivate the church and as you give it the opportunity, share the gospel. And remember this principle. Information doesn't move the heart. Concepts do not move the heart. Nor do emotions alone move the heart. Truth aflame is what moves hearts. What do I mean? When our hearts genuinely believe two things about the gospel. One, that it was a joy to the Father and the Son to rescue all of humanity and rescue those who become believers. That it was a joy. When we buy that, that will change the picture that we have of God and the picture that we have of ourselves. We'll recognize that as is, we bring joy to God. And when we recognize that, our lives will begin to change. Then secondly, when we recognize the value that Christ and the Father places on us, it will change us. Truth will become a flame. And I would recommend every day we should spend some time thinking about the cross and thinking about the God-man dying on the cross. Picture it. And as you picture it, think to yourself, that person is what I'm worth to God. That person is what I'm worth to God. Astounding. And then truth will become a flame.